think we'll start. Welcome to the Women's Studies Research Center. Karen, you're here. Would you like to introduce Erin?
No, you go.
No? Okay. My name is Lina Legore. I'm the Scholars Program Coordinator here at the WSRC. Today, we're going to listen to Eric Silverman's lecture on the Women in the Rhodes Scholars Project. Eric Silverman is a cultural anthropologist, formerly at Univ College. He has conducted ethnographic research in the late 1980s in a second river village in Papua New Guinea. He periodically returns, most recently in the summer of 2014. So if you're interested in hearing more about what the WSRC does and the lectures that we give, we welcome you to sign up on our sheet here in the front. And there are also some refreshments in the back if you'd like to partake. So, here's Eric.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to present you with this work in progress. In the opening years of the 20th century, Oxford University opened its gates to a small group of scholarship students from across the British Empire. The young men were selected on the basis of scholastic achievement, athleticism, moral force of character, and instincts to lead. Known as Rhodes Scholars, they were expected to embody the self-assured, benevolent paternalism of British imperialism. They were to become beacons of civic enlightenment in the still dark reaches of the colonies. Many years have passed since these select men sailed to Oxford, but Rhodes Scholars remain celebrated as statesmen, business tycoons, men of importance. The honor is a rare ticket to greatness, it is often said, and no small burden, as each scholar is charged to esteem the performance of public duty as his highest aim. The world may change, but Rhodes men remain at the helm. The scholarship was established through the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, the larger-than-life mining magnate, politician, avatar of British imperialism who died in 1902, forgive me. Like many middle-class sons of England, Cecil sought his fortune in the colonies. He set sail in 1870 to grow cotton in the Cape Colony. But the news of the day in southern Africa was diamonds, and that is how Cecil made his fortune, forming the De Beers Diamond Company. He would corner the global market, twice serve as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, sit on Her Majesty's Most Honorable Privy Council, lay plans for the now legendary Cape to Cairo Railway, and stand as the only living person on Earth at that time who could boast the name of a country, Rhodesia. During his studies at Oxford, Cecil became enthused by imperial fervor. His posthumous scholarship aimed to promote, quote, the union of the English-speaking peoples throughout the world. His will left a moderate fortune, which has now grown to about 150 million pounds. Rhodes first set aside funds for the colonial scholarships, Rhodesia, Natal, 4 schools in the Cape Colony, at the time all male, all white schools, Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, Canada, Bermuda, and Jamaica. He then specified the American scholarships, essentially 2 from each state and territory, and then he added Germany. Over the years, the Rhodes Trust has expanded the program to over 60 countries and more than 8,000 young people. Rhodes was clear in his will that he did not want, quote, merely bookworms. He wanted men of robust action, exemplary character, and bold striving. And he wanted only men. And so it was for many years. Coeducation today is hardly novel, but the admission of women into higher education was a fraught process, as wonderfully told, brilliantly told, by Nancy Weiss Malkuel in her book, Keep the Damn Women Out. It's an extraordinary book. At elite institutions, the idea of educating women was cause for moral panic. After all, wrote the eminent British psychologist Henry Maudsley in 1874, women were unlikely to scorn delights and live laborious days of intellectual exercise without injury to their functions as the conceivers, mothers, and nurses of children. No surprise, women were ineligible for the Rhodes Scholarship, too fragile to bear the manly lifestyle, too intellectually diminished. Women could certainly act in supporting roles for their husbands, but lead and lead men, heaven forbid. Only in the 1970s could women join the Rhodes Fellowship. But the successes of these women has remained unnoticed, their struggles unknown. Over the past year, through the Rhodes Project, I've been helping to correct these oversights. The resulting book will celebrate the careers of Rhodes women and will also offer lessons from the obstacles they have confronted and confront today. These are not impediments unique to so-called elite women. These struggles speak to every woman as I, a man, continue to learn.
Yay.
Or try to learn. One indication of the project's necessity is a comment in British biographer Philip Ziegler's quasi-official history of the program, published in 2008 by Yale University Press. The first male scholars arrived at Oxford in 1903. More than 70 years would pass before the admission of women. 3 days later, Ziegler wrote, and I quote him, "The advent of women does not seem notably to have affected the balance of scholars among the varied professions, though it has reduced the incidence of worldly success." Tell that to these women. Now, I cannot speak to other worldly success, but in regard to worldly success, Philip Ziegler doubly erred. For one, by any standards I will show, women Rhodes scholars have been stupendously successful. Not only do they compete with men professionally, but they often best men at the game of success as men themselves have defined it. For another, Ziegler was unable to look past his own gendered bias. Most conventional definitions of success adhere to standards and measures made by men on the basis of male values and tailored for male pursuits. Rhodes women have done enormously well by these standards, but they are also redefining the very terms of success. They, far more than male scholars, are committed to acting on a key mission of the scholarship, to esteem the performance of public duty as his, or her, I add, highest aim, to fight the world's fight, as the scholars like to tell it. Now, before I continue, I want to acknowledge the controversy over the recent Rhodes Must Fall campaign, which sought removal of statues of Cecil Rhodes at the universities of Cape Town and Oxford, and more generally, the decolonization of education. I do not address this debate here, but I do want to add that the mere presence of women scholars and their ethnic, religious, national, and moral identities is nothing if not the gender decolonization of every professional endeavor we will see they enrich. The Rhodes Project was established by Anne Olivarius, herself a scholar from 1978. Anne is a civil rights attorney and philanthropist, especially in regard to sexual harassment. She was one of the key figures in the famous Alexander v. Yale case, whereby a small group of women, including the then young lawyer Catherine McKinnon, sued Yale University using Title IX, what was then the new legislation of Title IX. They set legal precedent, and the courts ruled that sexual harassment for the first time was illegal on campus. For those who were still unclear about the meaning of the phrase sexual harassment, Anne coined the more pointed phrase date rape. She continues her pursuit of justice for women in academia, representing a number of women in some recent and well-known cases. Recently, too, Anne is representing women who have suffered so-called revenge porn. Now, I add this to indicate that a central goal of the Rhodes Project is to help decolonize, as it were, arenas in which men continue to dominate, sometimes with unchecked, uninvited, often illegal license. Needless to say, not all men were pleased with the admission of women into the Rhodes Fellowship. Anne was a finalist in 1977, the year the scholarship opened to women. She did not come from a place of privilege. When she decided to apply not only to college, but to the Ivies, her high school guidance counselor remarked, "You've got to be kidding." "Well," said her father, "nobody's going to marry you then." She went on to Yale and then applied for a Rhodes. Malcolm Forbes Sr. sat at the head of the regional selection committee. I should add that I just was looking for a picture of Malcolm Forbes and came across something on Google which says if you're under 30, you don't know who he is. Malcolm Forbes, as we know, was one of the more well-known, powerful business tycoons in the world, much hailed upon his death by the then President of the United States. Anyhow, Malcolm Forbes sat at the head of the regional selection committee. The final stage of the competition was a 2-day ordeal at an exclusive boarding school. The Friday evening reception was a formal affair. At it, the male applicants were all offered cigars and scotch, not the women. It wasn't that women weren't supposed to smoke or drink. They weren't supposed to be there in the first place. When the headmaster began the proceedings and addressed his rapt audience of young people, he himself, a long-ago Rhodes Scholar, he declared, 35 years ago tonight, I became a man. The headmaster's ludicrous pronouncement made it clear again, women did not belong. The next morning, each applicant was called individually into the interview and then dismissed back out to the group. So naturally, all the young people talked about what questions did they ask, what did they say. As it turned out, every single woman was asked the same question. What would you do if appointed secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare? The men were asked, what would you do if appointed Secretary of State? The questions were never reversed. There was one role for men and another lesser role for women. As the day continued, another woman and Anne were called back 4 or 5 times into the interview room for more questioning. It was obvious to all that the committee was trying to decide between the two of them. Then they announced the other woman's name. A short time later, Malcolm Forbes walked over to Anne, took the uninvited liberty to put his arm around her, and walked her outside. Look, Anne, I just wanted to tell you that it was really good. We really loved your interview. They were great. And we decided to go with this other woman. Okay. We decided we should tell you why. I'd be interested to know why. We decided to choose her because we felt that you could make some man senator someday. And my best advice to you is marry a good man and you'll be happy doing that. Malcolm, Anne responded. And now I wanted to quote Anne directly. It was no easy thing for me to call this powerful man by his first name because I was still at the age and came of age in the era when older men like him were addressed in formal terms. I hadn't yet quite crossed over to where I could address men like him as peers. But this was the moment of my crossing. And so I said, Malcolm, you don't understand. I don't want to make some man senator someday. I want to be senator. Malcolm Forbes stopped walking. Damn it! That's just the piece we couldn't understand about you. We hate this thing. What is this about? Anna Lavarius was dishonest. She didn't want to be senator, but she felt that she had to say so to make her point that a young female college student could like her male peers, create her own future. And that was what Malcolm Forbes had so much trouble understanding, and why the Rhodes Project is so important. The very next year, she received the scholarship. In the early years of the Rhodes, many committees of selection were embarrassed by their inability to find capable candidates. Between 1904 and 1918, 1/2 of all American men who aspired for the Rhodes failed at Oxford's mandatory entrance exam. Imagine if the committee had looked to women. In 1873, Annie Mary Ann Henry Rogers earned top spots in Oxford's entrance exam. She was offered a scholarship to the university. Yet, she signed the examination papers with her initials and took the exam by herself. When it was discovered that AMAHR was scrawled by a woman, the offer was rescinded. Her slight caused some controversy and prompted Oxford to initiate separate exams for women, but not yet to grant women degrees. She promptly won first-class honors, the very first woman to do so, and went on to become the very first woman don at Oxford. In 1920, Oxford finally issued degrees to women, and Annie Rogers received her well-deserved BA. Annie Rogers displayed considerable courage and poise, the very qualities Cecil Rhodes wanted in his young man. But when Cecil Rhodes established the scholarship, some of his stated criteria in the will included, quote-unquote, fondness for manly outdoor sports and qualities of manhood, such as truth, courage, duty, protection of the weak. This gendered inflection stood as policy for 70 years. In the late 1960s, the trustees of the scholarship finally took up the idea of admitting women. The warden of the Rhodes House, the person in charge of the stately building and the entire program, he was not enthralled. How would the women, he said, endure all the muscular jokes? But he realized, said Philip Ziegler in his book, that, quote, some sop would have to be thrown to the feminists. So he proposed a program of visiting fellowships for women. The trustees agreed, but the fellowships conferred no degree. They allowed women to use the library at Oxford and to sit in the senior common room. With delightful irony, the very first Rhodes Fellow, Susan Kippax, now emeritus professor at the University of New South Wales, amply demonstrated her mastery of manly sports. This is a true story. A few minutes after her interview at Oxford, she jumped into the River Cherwell to rescue a drowning man. In 1972, a stellar undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, Eileen Latch, applied for a Rhodes. She was turned down. With the support of the Minnesota Civil Liberties Union, she filed a lawsuit that received national press. The president of the university wrote to the trust that the university might need to withdraw entirely from the scholarship and other institutions would follow suit. The next year, even more women applied for the Rhodes and publicized their applications. Many of these women came from the Ivies, including Harvard, which increased public awareness. Complaints were filed with the Office of Civil Rights. Legally, this is now the latter 80s, much of the efforts in the US to admit women pivoted again on Title IX, which became law in 1972 and expressly prohibits gender discrimination. At the same time, in the UK, Parliament in 1975 passed the Sex Discrimination. A few years later, Her Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for Education finally struck the word manly from Cecil Rhodes's will. And the next year, women were finally admitted in 1977. When the Rhodes Trust announced the first group of women to earn the scholarships, it was worldwide news. But the New York Times, reporting on the story, put it in the Family in Style section. The paper mentioned that Laura Ablin Smith, one of only 5 students in her high school graduating class to go on to college, the Times mentioned that she was celebrated by her hometown newspaper with the headline, "Dumb Blonde Wins Rhodes Scholarship." She would later serve as Executive Vice President of Government Affairs and General Counsel for PepsiCo. The newspaper, the New York Times, also felt compelled to remark on the hostessing skills of the young women and their clothing. At Oxford, some of the women were lodged in rooms only with baths because, as one dean explained, ladies do not take showers. Rhodes House, the home of the scholarship, proved an equal challenge, such as the mandatory use of the title Miss by the staff. Men were accorded the gravitas and conjugal anonymity of Mr. Now today this might seem like a minor matter, but women in the 60s and 70s were struggling for even the slightest gestures that would imply equality. In the setting of Rhodes House, Miss conveyed a sense of juvenile status and pinned a woman's identity, of course, to her husband, or lack thereof. Some of the women scholars, this is again the very first cohort, drew up a petition. The warden was opposed, but at least he extended an invitation to a meeting, and there, the women were even offered sherry, which was the obligatory courtesy at any gathering of men. Yet the warden did something to the group of young women that, as far as they know, he never did to any meeting of the men. He asked his wife, Lady Williams, to offer her opinion. She scolded the young women for making a fuss. They needed, she said, to behave. And these women did behave, although not necessarily in the sense Lady Williams suggested in public. In private, however, I think Lady Williams would surely agree. More than 1,200 young women since 1977 have become Rhodes Scholars, and this is a map of where they come and their numbers. The large numbers of Americans, followed by some of the other countries, is simply a factor of the terms of Cecil Rhodes's original will. And here is a chart of all their professions. Almost every scholar, almost every woman scholar has pursued a white-collar profession. This comes as little surprise. We see that the largest employment sector is academia, followed by medicine and law. Taken together, academia, medicine, and law occupy the professional interests of 60% of all women scholars. About 15% are employed in government and the nonprofit sector, about 20% in commercial pursuits, and a smattering in letters, journalism, and other endeavors. And these percentages have remained almost consistent through each decade from the late 70s until today. What I want to do is highlight some of the women and their accomplishments with a nod to Mr. Ziegler's comment that they have not contributed much to worldly success. In the small cohort of 77 to 79, 1/2 of all women entered academia. They are now professors or senior academic or in senior academic posts. Of a dozen faculty, 1/2 have been honored with endowed or named chairs or center directors. As is the case with the professors in the other cohorts, and I can't stress this enough to the academics in the audience, as was the case with all the women professors who have been scholars, a full listing of their books, their journal articles, research grants, prizes, awards, presentations, and other academic pursuits would more than fill its own book. They are too numerous to mention. They are astonishing in their breadth and their depth. The 1970s cohort also included physicians, a medical school professor, several legal partners, 3 professors of law, 4 judges, an assistant attorney general in the U.S. Department of Justice, senior legal executive for the Commonwealth Bank Group, general group counsel for the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and a former director on the U.S. National Security Council. 5 women serve in government, including the current Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel, former Deputy Chief of Staff to President Obama, and the Senior Director of the 9/11 Review Commission for the FBI. Women from the cohort of the 1980s also include the President of American University and the President of Agnes Scott College, Elizabeth Kiss, who was just a few weeks ago appointed the first ever female warden of Rhodes House and CEO of the Rhodes Trust. There are several provosts, vice chancellors, deans, and more than a dozen named or endowed chairs from the 1980s cohort. Here again, the scope of academic fields is no less impressive, ranging from economics, history, linguistic, feminist studies, and the history of consciousness, to hematology, evolutionary biology, genetics, computer science, math, chemistry, immunology, and bioethics. Scholars from the 1980s who serve in government include Heather Wilson, currently Secretary of the U.S. Air Force, the highest military officer in the force, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Previously, she served as the first military veteran ever elected to Congress. Excuse me. A number of young women scholars, in fact, throughout the years, have previously attended the U.S. military academies that prepare officers, especially West Point. Now, these are women of extraordinary resourcefulness and courage, women who have exhibited equally remarkable intellectual gifts and leadership skills. Some of these women, too, like all women in military capacities, have endured appalling sexism and even sexual assault. As a man, I find it necessary again and again to remind myself that the awe-inspiring accomplishments of so many Rhodes Scholar women has been accompanied by asides, by gropes, by assaults, which I can barely imagine. The 1980s cohort of Rhodes Scholars also includes Susan Rice, former U.S. National Security Advisor during the Obama administration and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. The group includes Lieutenant General Michelle Johnson, Superintendent of the U.S. Air Force Academy, the first woman ever to lead a U.S. Department of Defense Service Academy. Previously, she commanded an Air Force squadron, served as Deputy Director for Information and Cyberspace Policy on the Joint Staff. Currently, she was recently appointed as Senior Vice President for the National Basketball Association, another formerly all-male institution of global renown. Other government positions in this cohort include Deputy White House Chief of Staff, Senior Director for European Affairs at the White House National Security Council, Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights at the U.S. State Department, the Chief of Staff at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Director of the Office of Trade for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs, who was herself once a High Commissioner and an Ambassador. In the 1980s, in business pursuits, I flag Shona Brown, recently Senior Vice President at Google. Fortune magazine ranked her the 6th highest paid woman in 2010 with a total compensation package, take note, Philip Ziegler, of over $16 million. She has been one of a relatively very small number of women who have held top-level management positions at Google, which amply attests that women are not only as suitable as men to enter the so-called C-suite, but in fact can excel and lead at the helm of any corporate venture worldwide. The C-suite, by the way, is so-called because Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer, it's all the sort of chief officers of corporations. The 1980s cohort also includes the Chief of Staff at the National Resources Defense Council, Rukmini Banerjee, who is CEO of India's largest NGO for the education of underprivileged children. It includes Andyambo Odaga, who is Managing Director of the Dangote Foundation, This is the largest private foundation in sub-Saharan Africa with an endowment in excess of $1 billion. The group also includes Senior Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer for Walmart, and who is also the president of the Walmart Foundation. The cohort of the 1980s also includes somebody perhaps more well known to many of you, Naomi Wolf. The 1990s are equally impressive. There is Professor Beth Shapiro, Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California at Santa Cruz, and a MacArthur Genius Grant Fellow. The group includes a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the ANU, or Australian National University, Director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the National University in Singapore, the Sidney W. Mudd Professor of Physics at Mount Holyoke, the Mohammed Kamel Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Henry Allison Endowed Chair in the History of Philosophy at UCSD, the Atlantic Richfield Associate Professor in Energy Studies at MIT, and more. The academic field studied by the women professors from the 1990s cohort include management, cognitive science, history, English, classics, philosophy, economics, and physics, linguistics, astronomy, molecular bioscience, anthropology, Maori and indigenous cultural and economic development, insect neuroethology, medieval history, theology, mechanical engineering, evolutionary biology, global health. In short, every significant field in the sciences, dare I say, both soft and hard. In the 1990s cohort, there are 20 appointments at law schools, the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of Microsoft, a senior attorney at the Equal Justice Institute in Alabama, which is a nonprofit law firm created to seek relief for death row prisoners who have been denied fair and just treatment in the legal system. In government from this cohort, there is the Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council in the Obama White House, Deputy Chief of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Canadian government, Gina Raimondo, who's the current governor of Rhode Island, the Canadian ambassador to Tunisia, U.S. ambassador to Botswana, deputy head of the Northern European section for the German Foreign Office, and many scholars from this decade, and indeed throughout all the decades, many of the women scholars serve in numerous positions at the United Nations. In the nonprofit world, the 1990s cohort includes the founder and president of the Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Center, and Anusuya Sengupta, who is the former chief grant-making officer at the Wikimedia Foundation and is now co-founder of a group called Whose Knowledge, a global campaign to center the knowledge of marginalized communities, the majority of the world, on the internet. In the business world, as in the other cohorts, women scholars have risen to senior and managerial positions with McKinsey, the Boston Consulting Group, PricewaterhouseCoopers, CVS, many investment in equity and finance firms, in other commercial ventures, including PayPal, and the group also includes the current director of diversity for Facebook, Maxine Williams. By any measure of worldly success, these women have clearly been extraordinary. Last from this cohort, I should mention another well-known scholar, Rachel Maddow, host of the Rachel Maddow Show. She was honored by the Interfaith Alliance with the Walter Cronkite Faith and Freedom Award. She was twice recipient of the Gracie Allen Award from the Alliance for Women in Media. She received the GLAAD Award by the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. She was the first openly gay anchor to host a major primetime news program in the US. She received honorable mention in the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity Prize in Ethics. The women who were scholars in the first decade of the 2000s are equally impressive in every field, from academia to medicine to law. Again, I stress that the range of scholarly areas, the positions they've attained, and the extraordinary number of their books, awards, prizes, directorships, and so on is breathtaking. Of course, the younger scholars have not yet risen to many senior positions by virtue of their age, but they will. Still, in the early 2000s, scholars have risen to be the British High Commissioner and former ambassador to the US, Trade Commissioner for Global Affairs Canada, who is also, and I'll return to this a bit later, a classically trained and recording pianist and songwriter, the former Special Assistant to President Obama and Associate White House Counsel, the Baltimore City Health Commissioner, a Member of Parliament for the New Zealand Green Party, Deputy Ambassador to the Australian Embassy to Jordan. These are kids who came of age in the 2000s. They're young people. The Director of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the Australian Government, the Health and Economic Policy Advisor in the office of our own Senator Elizabeth Warren, a leader of a political party in India, a senior program manager for UNICEF, the UN head of the field legal office in the Palestinian territories, and Namrata Bostrom, who is CEO and co-founder of popexo.com, an online community for women in India that has over 6 million users. For the most recent cohort, these are the youngest scholars. I will point to only 3. Joy Buolamwini, who is now a graduate student at MIT and founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, which seeks to solve the problem of bias in facial recognition against Black people like herself. In support of her work, she was awarded a grant as the grand prize winner of a national contest inspired